So good afternoon, everyone, or good morning to our American colleagues. It is my great pleasure to open our today's webinar dedicated to the transatlantic relations organized by the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute of the International Center for Defense and Security. My name is Kristi Raik, and I am director of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute at ICDS, and I am happy to moderate the discussion today. We will be discussing a report that was recently launched by Harvard Kennedy School and the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP. The report is titled Stronger Together, a strategy to revitalize transatlantic power. And it is an outcome of a project where strategists, researchers, practitioners from both sides of the Atlantic came together during last year and at numerous Zoom meetings discussed different topics and priorities of the transatlantic relationship, including security and defense, Russia, China, trade, technology, climate, and so on. And I was very happy to be part of the group. I greatly enjoyed these discussions. And I'm also very happy that we have the leaders of the group and several members of the group with us to discuss the report today. Now, one of my observations from the group was that we actually often had bigger differences among European members of the group than between Europeans and Americans, which I would read as a promising sign that there is actually a good basis for us to rebuild transatlantic cooperation in order to address the many challenges that the US and Europeans are facing in today's world, where we have democracies faced with confident and aggressive authoritarian powers, notably China and Russia, that challenge our values and our societal systems, also our alliance, our organizations such as NATO and the EU. But we also have global problems such as the pandemics and climate change, which more than ever necessitate multilateral cooperation, where hopefully the US and Europe can work together. Now, from the Estonian perspective, it's needless to say that for Estonia, the transatlantic relationship is the most important relationship. And it's really the top priority of Estonia's foreign and security policy. We have acute awareness in Estonia about the indispensable role of the United States in European security, including our national security. And Estonia has taken very seriously its contribution to the transatlantic alliance, which is the bedrock of our freedom and our ability to live in the kind of society that we want. I am old enough to remember growing up in the Soviet Union, and I can assure you I don't want back to any kind of authoritarian system. And for me personally, it was painful to watch over the past couple of years how the transatlantic cooperation was unraveling, how there was accumulation of mistrust and disappointments, and to see also how this process contributed to the erosion of the global rules-based order, which is so crucial, especially for small states such as Estonia. Now, one thing that was discussed a lot in the group and that is strongly stressed in the report is the need to revitalize our democracies. This is one thing I'm sure we will address today after last week's events in the US, and I must add also the increasingly surreal and polarized political reality that we are witnessing in Estonia. This is becoming all the more obvious, the need to revitalize democracies. and the ability of our societies to come together and for our political leaders to find ways to be more responsive to citizens and to reduce cleavages instead of deepening them is really crucial, not just domestically, but also for our security and for our ability to address global problems and have an influence internationally. So it's clear that as transatlantic allies, we face major shared challenges at home and abroad. And now that we are looking forward to Joe Biden's inauguration as president of the US next week, we have this unique moment to rebuild the transatlantic relationship and to adapt it to global changes and to make sure that our alliance remains the most successful alliance in world history. Now, before I give the word to our speakers, let me just quickly highlight some points from the report that are particularly important from Estonia's perspective. First, there is the need to strengthen the capacity of NATO to contain and deter Russia in all domains. For the Baltic states, the most important recommendation from the report is that NATO should make its troop deployments and rotations permanent in Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, as well as Romania and Bulgaria. Secondly, there is growing awareness also in this corner of Europe that we need to take more seriously the risks and threats that come with the continuing strengthening of China and the need to protect ourselves vis-à-vis China, to protect our critical infrastructure and technologies, for example. The third crucial issue is digital technology, even more important after last week's events. How can the US and Europe find a way to work together and to ensure a digital future where our democracies are protected and our citizens are protected also from external interference? So these are some of the issues, and now we have the opportunity to hear from the leaders of the strategy group and later from some of the members on the report, the recommendations, on the way forward with the transatlantic relationship. And before I introduce the speakers, I have a practical note to the audience. Please write your questions or comments to the Q&A function in Zoom. And I will do my best later on to pick up your questions and comments, and also to allow some of the people from the audience to present your questions orally. But now to the speakers. We really have a fantastic lineup of speakers today. First of all, we have Nick Burns, who is Goodman Professor of the Practice of Diplomacy and International Relations at Harvard Kennedy School. Nick is also former Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs and former Ambassador of the US to NATO and former US Ambassador to Greece. Thank you for joining us, Nick. The second speaker will be Dr. Daniela Schwarzer, Director of the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP. And Daniela has previously worked with the German Marshall Fund of the United States as an executive team member. And before that, at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, SWP, as a leader of the research group on European integration. So thanks for being with us, Daniela. Then we will have comments, reflections from two prominent Estonian foreign policy experts. We will have Keit Pentus-Rosimannus, who is a member of the Estonian Parliament and former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Estonia and former Minister for Environment. And we have Merle Maigre, who currently works as Senior Cybersecurity Expert at E-Governance Academy of Estonia. But her previous positions include Director of NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Tallinn. And Merle also worked for several years as the security policy advisor to Estonian presidents. So I'm really happy to have all of you with us. And I will now give the word to Nick and Daniela to present the project and the report.
Kristi, thank you so much. And thank you to the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute for hosting us this afternoon in Tallinn and around Europe. And welcome to all of us, all the Americans who are joining and North Americans here in the morning on our continent. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm very pleased to be with my colleague, my partner on this project, Dr. Daniela Schwarzer. You'll hear from her just a minute. This was a unique project of the German Council on Foreign Relations and Harvard Kennedy School. Daniela and I will tell you about our conclusions, and then we're looking forward to having David Sanger of the New York Times and other Americans and Europeans as part of our project speak. We're also really honored by the presence of the former Foreign Minister Kate Pentus-Rasimanos and Merle Maigret, of course, whom we know from NATO and from the US-Estonia relationship. So thank you to both of you for being with us. I just wanted to say a brief word, Kristi, if I could, about how important Estonia's story has been to those of us in the United States who prize human freedom and those of us who support NATO. I was special assistant to President Clinton when we helped negotiate the departure of the Russian troops from Estonia and Latvia in August of 1994, working very closely with someone that I admire, three people I admire very, very much. The late Lennart Meri, the president of Estonia, a great figure, I think, in Estonia's reclaiming its independence after the Soviet period. Thomas Henrik Ilves, who at that time was ambassador to the United States, a very close friend of mine still, and of course went on to be president and foreign minister. And Yuri Luik, at that time, I think the youngest defense minister in the world, but someone who remains a friend and a very distinguished person. And I think those of us in the Clinton administration, and I had an opportunity to speak to President Clinton earlier in the autumn about this, we're very proud of the effort that the United States made, that NATO made. We were working very closely with Sweden at the time to make sure that the Russian troops left after more than 50 years of illegal occupation of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And it was a proud moment for Americans because we never recognized the Soviet occupation, the Red Army's occupation from May 1940 until September 1991, when you reasserted your independence. We never recognized the Soviet occupation. And of course, the Baltic embassies, the legations, as we called them, in the 1940s and 50s and 60s were kept open. And I must say that one of the people that reminded me of how important it is to stand with for human freedom was Ernst Jakobsen. He arrived in Washington as a young Estonian diplomat in the mid-1930s, and he stayed through 1992 to represent the Estonian people through 5 decades when his country had been obliterated. I think it's one of the great stories of human courage that I can remember. So I wanted to say that to you today, that I'm really pleased to be with you. I want to thank Daniela and the German Council for being such great partners. Here's our idea. We didn't want to have a report about strengthening the transatlantic relationship. That would be an Americans talking to Europe or Europeans talking to Americans. So we formed a joint hybrid group. Kristi was very much a big part of it. We met pretty much every month in 2020, starting with in-person meetings in Munich, and in Berlin. And then when the coronavirus hit, we began to resort to weekly Zoom meetings, and that's how this group carried on. We're proud of our report. Our report is intended to do a couple of things. It's to make a call for a stronger transatlantic relationship, a more powerful transatlantic relationship, to, in essence, see the rebirth of it, because I can say on the American side that the United States has weakened the alliance under President Trump's leadership over the last 4 years. He has not been a faithful partner to our NATO allies. I think you know that our president-elect, Joe Biden, is going to be a faithful leader of NATO and member of NATO, as will be his Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, and his Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin. I'm sure of that. But we want to strengthen ties between us. We Americans know that Europe is vital for us because the EU countries and the United Kingdom are our largest trade partner and our largest investor in our economy. And NATO represents the greatest number of American treaty allies in the world. And I think we also can say, but Daniela and Kristi can say this better than me, that for Europe, the United States is an essential partner on security, as Kristi mentioned, on the issue of the independence of the Baltic states, for instance, and on trade and on the values issues. And the last thing I'll say before turning this over to Daniela is our group, our European American group, was convinced that the world has changed dramatically since 2016, since President Trump came into office. China is much stronger and much more assertive. Russia remains a real threat to all of us, from cyber and hybrid attacks to Estonia, as well as to the United States. We know that the coronavirus and the recession, the global recession, represent a twin challenge to the Europeans, as well as to the Americans. The good news for our group after November 3rd was that we would have an Atlanticist back in the White House in the person of Joe Biden and in the person of Kamala Harris. And Europe will have an American president with whom it can work. And so our report, Stronger Together, makes the case, let's reassert the strength of a NATO alliance and the value of the US-European Union partnership. And we present ideas for how to do that. And Daniela will speak to that question. Thank you, Kristi.
Thank you very much, Nick. And let me join in the thank you, first of all and foremost today, to Kristi for hosting us for this discussion. And I'm very, very glad that so many members of our group were able to make it as well. And a big thank you to everyone who worked together for, as was said, almost a year to produce this report. And my particular thank you goes to Nick for this fantastic cooperation over such a period of time where we at some point had to discuss scenarios. What do we do if Biden doesn't win the US elections? How do we go about our reflections? And the negative scenario, as we all thought, a second Trump term would be for transatlantic relations. So we are today in a very good place with manifold opportunities to do the right things in our transatlantic group of countries. And let me say upfront, when we speak about Europe, we don't only mean the European Union, but we include the UK and everything we say, except for when we speak explicitly about the EU. When we think about transatlantic relations on the other side of the Atlantic, we include Canada. So we think that there are good reasons to think of this large and powerful group of countries to take not only the mutual relationship into their hands, but also to build a joint outlook onto the world and its challenges today. So the report, which you may want to have a look at after the seminar, is organized in three major parts. The first part is about rebuilding trust at the heart of our alliance and democracy. The second one contains many elements of a joint strategy. So it talks more about the policies to adopt. And the third part speaks about the instruments, the institutions, the investments we need to make. So how to actually make all those ideas work. And I will briefly start with the first part before I hand it over to Nick for the strategy pieces. Now, in our discussions, it surfaced that the biggest task for transatlantic partners is to rebuild trust at the heart of our alliance. From a European perspective, this topic was, of course, most important in the past 4 years with President Trump in the White House, but the loss of trust, and you could see differences across several EU member states, that goes back earlier in time. So what united us in our perception on the European side was we need to make this a key issue in transatlantic relations, but we were not the only ones. Our American colleagues thought exactly the same things. And if from an American perspective, we speak about trust. It also means investment and commitment into the relationship on the European side. In our view, this topic of trust goes hand in hand with democracy and a commitment to liberal democracy. So those two principles, really, a trustful relationship of liberal democracies, is really what we build all our reflection on. And so the first part of our report really contains a number of ideas what should happen to be able to reconstruct trust, which we thought doesn't only depend on people. Of course, it crucially depends on people, and it is exceptionally lucky for all sides that Joe Biden, who is a committed transatlanticist, now sits in the White House. But we also think it needs institutional underpinning and a recommitment to that what we have. And so our first point really is that we suggest that that a NATO summit and a US-EU summit should come together as early as possible this year, actually, in order to reaffirm the mutual commitment that we have to each other. Article 5 of the NATO-Washington Treaty, but also on the European side, and including the UK, as I said, a strong commitment to a joint and transatlantic approach to global affairs, and a commitment of Europeans to enhance their capacity to act. The second major point, and I'm very glad that Constanze is with us today because she wrote an action plan on this particular issue. We believe that the transatlantic alliance can only work well across the Atlantic, but also shine in the world if we strengthen the legitimacy of our democracies. In an age, and that was a framing topic for many of the discussions we had, in an age of systemic competition. Of course, China immediately comes to mind, and we'll speak about that in a moment, but we think the key challenge, and last week's events in Washington showed that this is a huge urgency, of course, is to address the problems of democracy at home, in the US, in the EU, in single EU member states, and make sure we increase the resilience of our democracies as we cherish them. And that also means we have to roll back authoritarian tendencies within our region and within our alliance. So what we suggest is, for instance, to condition NATO security investment funds and EU financial support, which is very much the debate of the past few months, on a solid commitment of governments to liberal democracy. So we believe that if the transatlantic alliance is to defend democracy globally, we have to be absolutely credible at home. Finally, we believe that anything the transatlantic partners do in the world should be solidly grounded, not only in the principle of democracy, but also human rights. And we think that now there is a big opportunity with the new leadership coming in Washington to be more affirmative on human rights in order to counter the spread of Russian and Chinese style authoritarianism. With that, I hand it over to Nick to speak about the strategic priorities which we have identified. Over to you.
Daniela, thank you. Our second recommendation is to commit the European countries and the United States and Canada to a joint strategy on major issues. So of course, we believe that we have to be working together on the coronavirus pandemic. And as you know, our President-elect Joe Biden has said that he will return the United States to the World Health Organization on the afternoon of January 20th, that's next week. Second, that there should be much greater coordination between the European Union and the United States in dealing with a global recession and producing pro-growth policies in 2021 and 2022 for all the world. On an issue that I know is of great concern to Estonians and to Latvians, Lithuanians, Poles, our proposal in Stronger Together speaks to the need to be stronger in our defense against Russia, to contain Russia as a strategic objective of the NATO alliance, and to deter Russia in all domains. And therefore we believe, and we're advocating, that NATO make permanent its troop deployments to Estonia and Latvia, Lithuania. We began them as rotational deployments. They should be permanent deployments to tell the Kremlin and signal to the Kremlin that these countries are off limits, to Russia forever, and that these countries are fully part of the NATO alliance, and we will defend them. As President Obama said memorably, Tallinn is as important as Paris, London, and Berlin. Secondly, we hope that the United States, under President-elect Biden, will reconsider President Trump's ill-advised decision to draw down American forces in Germany. We think that would be a terrible mistake and would be the wrong signal to the Kremlin. Third, we believe that it's going to be very important, and David Sanger will speak about this, I know, to deter Russia with its cyber capacity, which we in the United States have seen all too clearly now with this major super hack against the American government and the American private sector. We also think that NATO allies have to agree as a floor to 2% of GDP on defense spending by 2024, but there has to be a major capabilities drive beyond that. And our allies, all of us, should be investing in artificial intelligence, in quantum sciences, and nano and biotechnologies as they're applied to military technology. And on the issue of Afghanistan, where every NATO member has had troops or personnel at one time or another, we must adhere to an in together, out together policy, meaning the United States under the Trump administration can't threaten to leave and leave our allies in the lurch. We have recommendations on China, and they're tough recommendations. To treat China as a predatory nation on trade, we believe the European Union, the United States, and Japan should present a united front in trade negotiations. I will just say, but Daniela can comment much more expertly than I. Personally, I wish the European Union had not gone forward with its trade agreement and investment agreement with China. I wish they had waited for the Biden administration to come in. We obviously also think that the transatlantic allies need to speak with a united voice to criticize and condemn the smothering of Hong Kong's democracy as we were writing our report over the last 6 months, and to condemn the treatment of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang province. We also believe that Huawei should be banned from the 5G networks of Europe, as well, of course, of North America. Finally, climate change will be, I think, for all of us, perhaps the most important issue over the next decade or two. Our group, our European American group, advocates that we build back greener, that we engage in North American European cooperation on massive reduction of carbon emissions and R&D supporting green technologies. And we also believe that the Nord Stream 2 project, at least most of our group, this was not unanimous, I want to be clear about that, but most of our group members believe that the Nord Stream 2 project and the sanctions on it by the United States should be suspended by mutual agreement by the United States and Germany and Europe. And we believe the US and EU should work out our differences on this very complicated and controversial project amicably and without public threats of the type that we've seen all too often from the Trump administration. We have recommendations on digital policy. We have recommendations on Iran, but I want to give Daniela the last word about the third aspect of our recommendations. Thank you.
So the third part of our recommendations is really on the how to do this. And what we argue is, first of all, we need to invest more. And what Nick has already mentioned is, of course, defense. But we think that we need a major investment initiative, in particular in the area of technology. So AI, cyber, quantum computing, some of the things Nick has mentioned, and I hope David Sanger will come in and say more. But in particular, Europe has a catch-up process to do. So we believe this investment initiative, both in defense and civilian spending, is key to come back to, at least from a European position, to catch up, and from American position to maintain its leadership position. Now, we also think there should be several fora which structure the transatlantic conversation going forward. I think at this moment in time, I would probably argue, if I had to rank them, the transatlantic dialogue on China is the first priority. Here, we think it should include the NATO and EU member states, and the idea would be to craft a shared strategy which includes trade, investment, technology, human rights, and also the approach towards China in multilateral institutions, which can very much be an element of a positive agenda with China when we think about climate change or when we think about tackling global health issues. Secondly, we suggest a transatlantic technology forum, really to bring together the efforts that are underway on both sides of the Atlantic anyway, in security and economic terms, but also the regulatory challenges, because obviously both Europe and the US, with their sheer market power, have a lot of regulatory power. In our view, this should be combined to make both a real sort of, first of all, to create a regulatory space across the Atlantic, but also to strengthen the role of the US and Europe in global regulatory questions. Finally, we think a transatlantic trade and economic dialogue should be set up and strengthened. It should include not only the EU, which is obviously on the European continent the major trade negotiator, but it should also include the United Kingdom and the countries of the European Free Trade area who are not EU members, and of course Canada. Now, the goal would be to reduce tariffs and non-trade barriers, and in particular to coordinate positions within international organizations that deal with these issues, in particular the WTO, but also the OECD, and also to work together on reforming the WTO, which is urgently needed. Final point for the institutional piece, there should be an EU-US Energy Council to coordinate investment and policies on clean energy and the diversification of energy sources. And Nick already spoke about Nord Stream 2. So this whole issue of energy from our group's perspective has a hugely important strategic component, in particular with regards to the relationship with Russia. I finally want to mention two additional initiatives which we think should be put into place. One would be a major transatlantic initiative to support democracies at risk. Of course, both the US side and European countries, but also EU institutions and EU funds already do this. We think this should be coordinated at least, and maybe even integrated in some regards, to have a very, very strong role in advancing liberalism and freedom in the world. And the final point, which may sound smaller, but is in our view of a very big strategic importance, it is to set up a European, American, including the UK and Canada again, initiative to provide an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a major worry from a European perspective in our immediate neighborhood, but going further east, it is important as well. And our group agreed that this is not only a European, but also an important American interest. So with that, I'm giving it back to Kristi for the further moderation of our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick and Daniela, for talking us through the main recommendations and conclusions. So I will now give the floor to Keit Pentus-Rosimannus to hear her view on the prospects of the transatlantic relations, on the recommendations that we have just heard. And maybe there is also something that you think is missing from the report. Keit, over to you.
Thank you, Kristi, and thank you all. First, I must say that it's really a fascinating work that you have done with the report. And I think it's really necessary discussion that we are having today, and I'm really proud to be part of it. Well, obviously, it is true that the expectations are really high after the US presidential elections. And I think that part of those expectations is connected with the hopes to restore the predictability in our relations. And that part, I think, is relatively easier one. The other part, big part, is the will to use really the momentum for agreeing on a real joint global agenda. To use the momentum to get us to the point where we could say that, all right, now we really do have the world's most powerful joint economic bloc that also shares or has the joint strategies for global challenges like climate, tech, energy, and also joint strategies, or at least joint stance towards China and Russia. And I thought that maybe from a bit, I will start from a bit general view because sometimes I still get asked why is this United Bloc totally irreplaceable? And I believe that in a longer perspective, it really is the only bloc that could give working solutions to global problems. Let it be climate, also pandemics, working solutions that really do strengthen the democratic values and the not autocratic values. And also the really functioning transatlantic bloc is the only functioning security guarantee. And of course, immensely beneficial to our citizens. And also, it is the only bloc that could balance the China's reach for hegemony. Impossible for US alone. It would be far impossible for the EU alone as well. Sometimes when I participate the discussions over the transatlantic relations or the warming up the transatlantic relations now after the presidential election in US, I get the feeling that we discuss it in a manner as it would mainly be, if not only, be up to the US, and that is not the case. An honest assessment, I think, tells us that there are certainly important parts where the EU needs to speed up and improve our homework as well. And I really like the way this report draws the attention to both sides. Now, from the report, I want to pick up or bring out three things that I think, or as I see as really crucial for getting us closer to this United Bloc. And those three things are China, Russia, and climate. So first, China. Again, it is no secret that one of the big concerns for EU, for Europe, has been that the US will concentrate its focus on China, and that our region, not only security concerns, but in a wider way, will simply be pushed to footnotes, to put it very bluntly. And this, for this reason, I think that the recommendation to have the transatlantic dialogue on China, which would include all NATO and EU member states, is certainly well needed. And I think it is especially important now after the investment and trade agreement developments between the EU and China. That said, I also think that in Europe, in definitely some states, we urgently need to get rid of the misconception that the rise of China will be or is the US problem. It is not, again. It will be our problem at least as much. And again, the only realistic way to counterbalance China is to do it with a united transatlantic bloc. Both sides benefit, both need it, and neither could do it alone. One of the reasons the EU has kept looking towards China is simply the need to find markets for our export-oriented economies. As TTIP was declared dead, that was one of the counter-reaction. If we could make the transatlantic economic bloc function with removing as many barriers as possible, that would certainly minimize also the appetite for a Chinese market on European side. So if China is top strategic concern for the US, I think it is really hard to find a better remedy for keeping the EU away from China's big market temptation than to offer a better alternative. Certainly our policies, China policies will be different ones. We will have differences in our China policies, but if we truly want to make the relation function, I think we need to be on the same page when it comes to the strategic questions in China policy. Now, second thing I picked up from the report is Russia. Nothing has changed for the better in that front. Russia's goals remain the same. Reduce the US role in the world in whatever way possible, divide the EU internally, also divide the EU and US, and so on. And of course, almost all, if not all, the security threats in our region are connected with Russian activity. The information ops, cyber attacks, but also Cold War style military activities. Also the deployment of weapons along the borders of Baltic states, all this is there, here, not there. And as we very well know, it is not only our region where the interfering appears. What is needed is certainly a coordinated, quick and precisely targeted response, because obviously Russia takes the lack of it as a clear sign of weakness. And the same goes for the mixed signals about collective defense, Article 5, and commitments to deterrence, for sure. Europe, from our side, has to take more responsibility for defending and protecting itself. The need to increase the defense spending has not disappeared. It's there, but the US leadership in NATO, the military presence in Europe is also more crucial than ever, I can say. And the deterrence simply is not credible without the US, and the presence of the US is credible if it is not on ad hoc basis, but permanent. So why I wanted to bring out Russia is that the failure to maintain unity in that stance, the failure to maintain credible defense and deterrence against Russia could be fatal again for the transatlantic alliance. And now, third point I want to conclude with is where I see not only the needs, but also certainly a potential for joint agenda, and this is climate. The impacts of climate change will be visible in absolutely every sector by the end of this decade. It will also have direct impact on threat map for NATO. It will be a joint concern, and it will be impossible to tackle with the security as well as economic consequences coming from climate change without acting as a bloc again. Both the EU and US new administration has put climate high on the agenda. I think it is just excellent moment to push that agenda together on a global scale. And I would like to add just two nuances to the report concerning the climate. One is the direct impact on the security of NATO and EU member states that needs the attention on both sides of the Atlantic. I have recommended a NATO's and EU's joint exercise where quickly evolving climate emergency could be part of the scenario. And as someone who has taken part on some of those exercises, it really does help to put things into perspective. And I think that if there is one lesson from the ongoing pandemic, it is that it is hard to be too much prepared. And the second remark is about Arctic. Arctic, I think, is a region where, because of the quickly evolving climate change, the economic, strategic, and also the security interests of all the major players could possibly collide in a very near future. And I personally do think that it would be certainly wise to try to avoid any conflict between the US, Canada, and EU that is avoidable. And I think that Arctic is one of those that could need careful attention. And finally, I especially like the spirit of seizing the moment that the report holds, because maybe some of you have noticed that pretty much already the next day after Biden was elected, some professional skeptics already started to say that no, don't get too excited, because we don't know what will happen in 4 years. True that, but we do have a really long-awaited moment to do our very best to move quickly towards this world's biggest economic bloc that could have joint agenda. And I think that if we succeed in this, we can be also much more confident in 4 years' time. So thank you, and sorry for going a bit too long, probably, Kristi.
Thank you so much, Kate, especially for placing the transatlantic relationship really in the broad global context and showing that in Estonia, we do think not just about our national security and how important the US is for our security, but we do also think about the bigger picture and the challenges that the US and Europeans are facing in the world. But now I will give the word to Merle, who has an impressive experience in foreign policy making and is especially an expert on cybersecurity. So maybe you want to also comment on technology in particular. Merle, please.
Thank you very much, Kristi, and I thank you for bringing me in and giving me a reason to associate myself with this great report, really important and great work done by both the Harvard Belfer Center and DGAP, and I'm really glad to have a reason to be speaking on this at a forum presented by ICDS. I think it's great that you, Kristi, are involved with this report and link this important topic with Estonia. But indeed, I'll try to focus on the tech issues. And I'll try to be brief so that to allow time for questions and comments. So I think technology offers opportunities to protect and improve our world. We're all in the middle of a digital disruption accelerated by COVID, where the importance of digital and tech has been evident to everyone. If the current pandemics is to be halted, if global warming is to be slowed, if the economic growth is to be recovered, technology will definitely play a critical role. So it's really great that this report has focused on this area as well. Technology also naturally poses fundamental challenges, and some of the key challenges that the transatlantic community faces into tech are issues such as how can we secure our democratic values in the digital system. This is about data security, data privacy, as well as the relationship between technological security and the survival and spread of liberal democracies. There's also the question of how can we make digital innovation happen on both sides of the Atlantic. And there is the question of how can we jointly build cybersecurity resilience? Because I think over the past 4 years, unfortunately, there has been little discussion on this topic at the government-to-government level. So I would pick out 5 topics from the report that seem particularly relevant, that I'd like to comment, that seem relevant for me from the Estonian perspective, and perhaps I'll add a few thoughts along the sides to ideas put forward in that report. So first, I'm a keen believer that at the heart of technology, there is always a human factor. I therefore strongly favor the recommendation that White House needs a senior cyber coordinator who may also be a deputy national security advisor with appropriate staff and structure. Idea put forward in the report. It could mean the resurrection of the cybersecurity coordinator position that the Trump administration eliminated back in April 2018. I think various responsibilities of the Office of the National Cyber Director within the Executive Office of the President could include to develop and oversee implementation of the National Cyber Strategy, to coordinate national incident response activities and provide cybersecurity policy advice to the President, the White House. Having a clear, wise, and professional owner and driver of cybersecurity issues in the White House, I think, would also greatly contribute to the transatlantic cooperation and to the trust that Daniela referred to earlier. So that's one. Second, I strongly applaud the relaunching of meaningful multilateralism, which also contributes to rebuilding trust on both sides of the transatlantic. That is to renew key international relationships needed in the fight against cyber attacks. This is about US, EU. This is about relationship within NATO, with Five Eyes, and also bilaterally. And as part of that effort, I strongly support the idea put forward in the report to set up a transatlantic technology forum of decision makers who can discuss important topics. I think this is a great proposal. I also really liked the precise tone underlining that this would be an action group, a single forum, a broad coordinated structure designed to discuss a set of issues in transatlantic technology policy instead of the usual piecemeal conversations. I could see that really going ahead, and I think this is something that two sides of the Atlantic really need. The Transatlantic Technology Forum could drive unity of effort on various security, economic, and regulatory challenges and set up global standards that could protect privacy, competition, transparency, and fairness, and it all comes together under technology. This forum could focus on the connections between technology and the risks to liberal democracy. Common goals, help to build government to find and work towards common goals in artificial intelligence and data protection, digital supply chain security, work on the joint industrial policy, and work on and be a leader in international standard setting. The report was concrete enough, I think, to put forward the idea that in order for that forum to speak from authority, it should be led on the US side by the above named Deputy National Security Advisor, because that would give the sort of like the White House channel to the report. And I think it's equally important to think of a respective or adequate level be co-leading it on the EU side. My third comment refers to NATO, of course. I think it's important for the US to focus on NATO. This has been mentioned before, but also to focus on NATO from the cybersecurity aspect, and for the both sides of the transatlantic to find NATO as an important forum to fight against cyber, to jointly combat cyber attacks, and to discuss the military side of cyber defense. In practical terms, that would mean to prioritize developments in NATO to make sure that NATO stays the cyber superpower. Another aspect to making NATO important in tech issues is to jointly support emerging technology R&D in NATO. Something that I see the EU already having taken steps in investing into the European Defence Fund, but this is an activity that could also happen in NATO. provide greater financial and regulatory incentives within NATO for transatlantic science and technology partnerships, including collaboration on R&D for emerging technologies such as drones, cyber situational awareness, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and robotics. Another aspect that was not mentioned in the report, but I think is important to underline, that when using NATO in cyber, allies on both sides of the Atlantic could build on great work already done in the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Tallinn. So to look at the work that's been research work and the good activities going on both in research, exercises and both in tech and strategy in NATO CCD COE, not to mention, for example, a great cyber commanders forum that regularly meets at the margins of the NATO CCD COE already. I think it's important to perhaps revitalize that forum, to invite cyber commanders over regularly and to have them focus on the military issues of cybersecurity. Fourth point, something that was mentioned in the general terms about reaching out to outside democracies. I would call it helping the digital build-up in the development world. I think it's important for the two sides of the Atlantic to recognize that there is a world out there, and if we do not help them, they come to us, particularly with in cyber attacks. So it is important to engage in coordinated outreach to emerging economies, which means development of resources and coordination of tools needed in cybersecurity and digital field. And my last point, perhaps a smaller issue, but nevertheless important, I think, from the Estonian point of view, refers to something that Kate said on exercises. Maybe it's an Estonian thing. I also am a keen believer in joint exercises, and something that was not perhaps put forward in this report, but I think it's important to mention in series of joint joint strengthening of the cyber resilience. I would propose considering organizing some regular senior level tabletop exercises. It could be transatlantic in the wider meaning of it. It could also be something a bit more narrow, like Nordic-Baltic senior level tabletop exercises, to test the transatlantic ability of partners to respond to a cyber aggression against critical infrastructure. These cyber crisis simulations games should include a worst case scenario, disaster scenario, sort of to highlight gaps in readiness. And it doesn't come out of the blue, but these types of exercises actually build on prior history, I think, which is very positive. Back in 2017, Estonia hosted an EU defense ministers tabletop exercise, hour and a half of ministers sitting in one room, including a NATO SecGen, testing out crisis reactions to crisis. Back in 2019, Finland, as part of Finnish EU Council presidency, hosted all EU internal ministers or home affairs ministers, a hybrid crisis exercise. And back in September, there was a Nordic-Baltic foreign ministers meeting in Tallinn, which also included a tabletop exercise. So that gave a sort of idea to include Nordic-Baltic US exercise. Why it is important, I think it is because regularly exercising response to cyber attacks at a ministerial level can lead to more accountability ultimately in cyberspace, because accountability is very closely linked with transparency and attribution, and exercising this through helps ministers or any other high-level people to to understand what are they missing when push comes to shove and when there's a real attack. So summing up, I think cybersecurity requires resilience as well as strong defenses. The incoming Biden administration has pledged to make cybersecurity a top priority at every level of government. And I think, I mean, of course, the Europe and the US cannot hope to be primus inter pares in all key technologies, but they can strive to be global leaders collectively through an alliance. So I'd stop here and would be happy to be part of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Merle, for these very policy-oriented comments and for endorsing many of the report's recommendations. As an Estonian, I feel guilty now that I did not highlight the work of the NATO Cyber Center of Excellence in Tallinn in the group. Take it as my failure. But since we have with us now the authors of the technology action plan of the report, Catherine Kluwer-Ashbrook and David Sanger, would you, Catherine and David, come in at this point and continue a bit more on this tech issue and maybe react to some of Merle's points? Who would like to go first? David?
Why don't we have Catherine go first and I'll follow up.
Okay, thank you. First of all, Merle, you've done a stellar job at summarizing what David and I took a number of months to put together in this form. So clearly we should make you our spokesperson because you have buffered and buffeted what we have put together, because I think what you've clearly articulated is and I think the last few weeks to even people who are outside the cyber and tech bubble, we spoke about it. We spoke about the hacking of the European Medicines Agency, vital to providing vaccines and public health delivery in the middle of a global pandemic. We all alluded to the SolarWinds hack, where we still don't know exactly how deep or potentially cataclysmic the impact will be. 250 American federal agencies affected by that hack, and David has done some stellar reporting on the breadth of that hack. And then, of course, everything that we witnessed so vividly over this past week, the impact of technology in eroding our very social fabric, the trust that we have amongst one another, that is the undergirding of the transatlantic relationship, I think gives everything that you have added to our recommendations greater urgency. I think David and I, everybody on this call, is heartened by a number of moves now, not only by the incoming Biden administration, by appointing very senior experts to the National Security Council. We'll have to see if something more emerges from that comes close to what David and I recommend in the paper. But I think we're also happy, though much too late, frankly, for all the challenges, Merle, that you rightly put in front of us, the creation of a cyber and emergent technology part of the US State Department. I think we're probably on average about 9 years too late for that. And the State Department there has undergone a number of reconstructions of its work on that issue. But the important thing is that we're all vividly focused on this, and that we have agreed that technology in the way that it works now touches all aspects of our lives. And if we don't come together, and I think that's the positive spin on our piece, to figure out not only joint reactions, but joint actions on issues like how we manage AI, R&D. Nick said this, of course, in the introduction to our report. There are technological solutions to the 5G challenge. The United States has put, a lot of impact or a lot of emphasis, on figuring out software solutions to the 5G, 6G issue. And I think merging our capacities, our technological capacities, there is absolutely a chance for us jointly to be outpacing China while securing our systems. Too long have we treated these issues in the European Union, I think, as sort of technology or corporate issues. And everything that we have seen over the last, particularly the last 2.5 years, points to the fact that these are very clearly security issues, that they touch many other aspects of our lives. So I think we've arrived at a pinnacle point. And I frankly, personally am heartened by what we're seeing happen in this transition team, but also that the Europeans are getting much more serious about having a transatlantic dialogue. They realize, notwithstanding the Digital Services Act, which, you know, on the front of it reads as an attack solely on American corporates, they realize that in order to muster this and in order to really see action, they cannot do it without transatlantic cooperation. So, you know, at the beginning of a new year, I'm frankly heartened by all the action that we can take. And my great hope is that people will read this report, they will turn to people like you, Merla, and others in Europe to realize how we can really take action on this, because I think the action steps are very concrete, straightforward, and most importantly, they're possible.
David, would you add your view? We don't hear you. Unmute yourself, please.
Great, thank you very much, and wonderful to be here with all of you, and it was really a great experience to work on this whole project together. I really enjoyed it, and it's particularly good for a reporter who's also a part-time teacher at Harvard to sort of take this moment and try to think about where we've been in the past 4 years and where we're headed. So a couple of points I'd make overall, and then I want to pick up on what Merle was discussing in that very good tech conversation and that Catherine picked up on so well. The first thing to remember is I think the Biden era is not going to reset the clock to January 20th, 2017, as many in Europe hoped. Views of China have hardened dramatically in the US. I would say that when Biden left office as vice president, the thinking inside the Obama administration as it left at the time was that we could still find ways to work China into a Western consensus. That is still the view in Europe by and large. I do not believe that is a view in the US. And in fact, if you look at the people who Biden is putting in around Asia policy, it's a pretty hawkish group. The second is that the disputes over Huawei, over China's effort to wire much of Europe, over how to deal with China Telecom, how to deal with China's activities in Eastern Europe, I think those disputes will continue. I think that while the Biden administration will do a much better job of trying to bring the Europeans into the process consensually, I don't think you're going to see any of Mike Pompeo's, you know, if you don't do what we say, we're cutting off your intelligence access and so forth. I think the fundamental differences will probably remain. And we saw some of that in our own internal debate about this report. Very healthy debate, I would say. Same on the Russia challenge, which has really deepened since we wrote this because of the SolarWinds hack. I think there is a sense within among my European friends that SolarWinds is primarily an American problem. It isn't. Of the 18,000 companies that used SolarWinds Orion software, which is the one that the Russians got into, there's a very large presence in Europe, including in NATO. And we ought to be thinking about that, because not only is SolarWinds widely used in Europe, but we haven't really focused very well on how much the Russians are using that access inside Europe. All of this points to the need for a much better common approach on both China and Russia. And that means a greater focus on figuring out what is truly critical infrastructure, right? So at the time we were writing this report, in all of our debates, we didn't really talk very much about supply chain attacks of the kind that you've seen in SolarWinds. But clearly, in a global world in which we are all dependent on very similar software platforms, this somewhat brilliant Russian effort to get inside the supply chain, not to try to attack the Pentagon or the Commerce Department or NATO or anything directly, but instead to get into that software, poses a much broader threat that we just haven't discussed in common. Similarly, it means that when we're coming up with alternatives for using Huawei or China Telecom, we have to come up with ways for European countries and for American companies to have a reasonable alternative. And that means leveraging the technology at Nokia and Ericsson together with US firms. Same thing on Nord Stream 2. You're not going to solve this problem unless you address the European need for the gas that flows. I wanted to turn just briefly to what we heard before from Merle on cybersecurity. The European discussion on this tends to be on cybersecurity only, and I think you were right to bring up resilience as a huge issue. So you know you're going to get attacked. How well can you recover from that? I think you're absolutely right to bring up the fact that we have common privacy concerns. What worries me the most right now, though, is that NATO and the United States do not have a common cyber offense policy to go together with their cyber defense policy. And they need to, because the fundamental problem is that there's a sense among our adversaries, the Russians in particular, that there is no price to pay for the kind of daily cyber conflict, the short of war conflict we're seeing. This isn't a matter of spending more money. I know that the US and NATO have been in arguments about budgets for 4 years. It's actually a matter of having a common strategy. And it's as ridiculous for NATO to have no clear offensive cyber strategy as it is if you had suggested in the 1960s or 1970s that NATO didn't need a common nuclear strategy along with the United States. We put together that nuclear strategy. We have it well practiced. We understand what weapons are at that are available to us, and we understand their role in deterrence. We have not had that very public conversation, and it needs to be public if it's going to be a deterrence strategy inside NATO. There's a lot in the defense section of our reports, which I urge you to look at, which were headed up by Victoria Nuland. Victoria, of course, is now headed off to be Undersecretary for Policy. I think that's Nick's old job. He probably left her notes sitting in the desk someplace. But that is really worthwhile reading with care. And then a final point here about Merle's very good point about the need for having real cybersecurity coordinator roles inside the White House. You're absolutely right. I think within 24 hours, I know that within 24 hours, you will see the first announcement of who will be in those posts. There are people who are thinking hard about both offense and defense, and I think that's useful. And I think that we can put together a common strategy, but it's actually going to require the US listening to the Europeans on where their priorities are, and the Europeans thinking about offense as well as defense. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, David. So time is flying, and I still want to bring in both Tori Tausig and Constanze Stelzenmüller, who are with us, and to raise a couple of questions from the audience. But let's now move on first on the China issue, which has been raised by so many speakers. And Tori, you authored the China Action Plan in the report. As we have heard, we expect now more serious dialogue between the US and Europe on how to approach China, but also we expect different views to persist. And one of the questions from the audience is precisely related to this, and on the recent EU-China investment agreement. Piret Kuusik of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute raised this question: how do you see the impact of that? What is your view? Sorry.
Well, thank you, Kristi. Thank you for hosting this event. On the China topic, one takeaway I had from our strategy group is that we were very much aligned on what we needed to do on China. It was one of the issues where I thought we had broad agreement across Americans and Europeans. First and foremost, that we need a joint agenda and a joint strategy for taking on shared challenges from China. I'll just outline a few of what we saw as our shared goals vis-a-vis China in the transatlantic space. One was to level the economic playing field with China. Parallel to that is to really end China's uncompetitive and unfair trade practices that are disadvantaging both American and European companies. Thirdly, that we need to challenge China's human rights abuses and poor labor and environmental standards that run counter to US and European values. And finally, that we need to limit China's authoritarian influence in our politics, our societies, and in our technological systems. And we had a robust debate on 5G on this very issue. Now, to get to the question of what the comprehensive agreement on investment between the EU and China does to our ability to achieve these shared goals together, I think it's first and foremost lamentable that the EU moved forward on this timeline, right on the eve of a Biden administration coming in. Biden has indicated that he would like to move beyond the unilateral trade practices that the Trump administration pursued with China and really try to forge a united front with the EU and with Japan in taking on some of these shared challenges from China. I think one of the starting assumptions we had as a group is that this united front is the only way to maintain leverage in the West over China's trade, technology, and growing political prowess in our multilateral institutions. So that's another reason that this, the timing and the optics of agreement move forward as they did, because I think it does hurt our leverage in achieving some of these goals. And I'll just say, as a final point, one of our recommendations, and we make many recommendations on a shared transatlantic agenda on China, but one was to launch a transatlantic dialogue where we talk about how we are going to address shared grievances in Chinese trade practices, technological advancements, and China's growing voice in multilateral institutions. I think that this agreement really hamstrings that dialogue in the first 90 to 100 days of a Biden administration. You know, if this agreement had not moved forward on this timing, maybe there would have been more momentum to really launch this dialogue. And now I think this transatlantic dialogue on China perhaps moves further down the list of priorities for a transatlantic agenda, which is the final point that I think that this is lamentable. I also think that it shows that the Europeans and first and foremost Chancellor Merkel perhaps don't see the US as a viable long-term partner in securing European interests vis-a-vis China, which shows that we really have our work cut out for us as the Biden administration gets in place. To close, I think that the momentum for transatlantic dialogue on China moves further down the list of priorities, and I think that we have our work cut out for us on getting on the same page strategically in the ways that we view China. So it'll be an interesting, first few weeks of a Biden administration, but I definitely think this sets us back a little bit.
Thank you, Tori. Unfortunately, we have no more time to hear the views of other members of the group. But now I definitely want to turn to Constanze, who contributed on what I would say is fundamentally the most important issue in the report, and that is democracy. In our discussions, we kind of kept coming back to it. And why is the rise of China so problematic? Because it comes with this systemic rivalry and threats to our democratic systems. What kind of challenges we have inside our societies? We have very similar issues of polarization and cleavages and rise of radical populism on both sides of the Atlantic. And as you write in your contribution, Constanze, most of the problems that we have with our democracies today are actually homemade, but they have huge implications for our global influence and ability to defend our values and to promote our values. So, Constanze, what would be like your main messages after this project that you would like to convey?
Hi, everyone. First of all, I want to sort of join my thanks to Nick and to Daniela for convening this working group, which I thought was really quite a memorable and productive experience in working together. And I'm having done this kind of thing before. Daniela knows what I'm talking about. I was most impressed by the degree of professionalism, specificity, and just the fabulous collaboration that we enjoyed over several months during the summer and the fall of last year. I'm not sure that the topic democracy is the most important one in this report. I have to say that I am electrified by a lot of the issues that are in there, but it is certainly the cross-cutting issue. And I find it quite remarkable that similar projects have sort of published reports over the past few months without mentioning or making a larger effort to address the issue of democracy. That I find remarkable and hard to understand. You may have noticed that some of my colleagues at Brookings have in the past couple of days, in fact, I've just been tweeting them, I think some really important contributions on this topic. And there's a debate going on here, which of course has been triggered by the ghastly events at the storming of the Capitol last week, as to what impact this has on America's legitimacy and soft power, and whether it shouldn't now focus completely on democracy at home. I believe that my colleague Thomas Wright is correct to say that we need to do these things at the same time. We need to walk and chew gum. We need to address our democracy issues at home because they are the essential precondition, and this is, I think, new in the debate, of our resilience, of our effectiveness, and of our legitimacy when we engage in shaping foreign and security policy. I think we've all learned that the great powers and superpowers are not immune against democratic flaws and failures. We have learned in the past years that democracy is not self-repairing and self-legitimizing. And this, I think, was again, one of these assumptions that we coasted on for far too long during the post-Cold War period. Some of you will have read the legendary essay by Thomas Bagger in Germany on how the Germans in particular misunderstood the 1989 moment as a validation of the German approach. And I think in some ways that applies to all of us. I'm going to leave it there and just say the recommendations in this Democracy Action Plan are directed in particular at dealing with democratic backsliding among our allies in NATO and partners in the EU. And that we, I think, all agreed that we need to have a far more forceful posture with regard to that as well. And that if we don't, that will have significant security implications for the viability and the legitimacy of both the European Union and NATO in the future. Something that we cannot risk. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Constanze. You always make this point so forcefully and elegantly. Thank you. Now, it is time for final remarks. I would like to get back to the speakers once again. I also have one question from the audience that I want to raise now, and maybe Nick can say something about it. And the question is from James Sher of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute, and it concerns the discussion that we have seen in recent months about whether there is a need for some kind of new understanding vis-a-vis Russia, which some have interpreted as another kind of reset. And it is not very clear what is meant by these proposals to have a new understanding. So Nick, maybe you can offer your take on what this discussion in the US is about. Is there anything new we should expect from the Biden administration's approach vis-a-vis Russia? But at the same time, please, Nick and the other speakers, now is the time for any final remarks that you would like to make. So Nick, please.
Kristi, thank you very much. And I want to thank everyone who's spoken from our group. You've heard from many of us, including Costanza just now, and Tori, and Catherine, and David, and Daniela. And I'm really grateful to all of our European and American members and you, Kristi, for producing this report, because we do want a stronger transatlantic relationship. Maybe I should leave it to Daniela to sum up. I will just answer the question, Kristi, that you posed. It's a personal view. I don't know if everyone agrees with me. I think there's very little chance that the United States is going to move towards a so-called reset with Russia. There was a small group of Americans who spoke out during our election campaign calling for a reset. I think the majority of people that I know in the Democratic and Republican parties who are active in the Congress, some who will be active in the new administration, many would not agree with that. How can we agree with a reset after what Russia has done in Ukraine, in both Crimea with the annexation and in the Donbass? How can we agree with a reset when Russia poses a continual threat to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, a threat we take so seriously that we have stationed NATO troops in the 3 Baltic countries, and our report is calling for those troop rotations to be permanent troop deployments, because the word we use in our report is we have to contain Russian power and deter Russian power as well. And especially after the super hack, the SolarWinds hack, there are people in both of our parties in the United States, political parties, who are furious with the extent and depth of what the Russians have done. So I think there's very little chance of a reset. And I certainly personally would object strenuously to it as a citizen of the country. I'm not involved in the Biden transition team, but I was a supporter of President-elect Biden. And my sense is that our national security establishment, the people who are career members of the Foreign Service, of our military and intelligence agencies, the new team is looking for ways to contain Russian power, not to somehow facilitate it. I hope that's clear.
Thank you. This is the answer I was expecting from you. Thank you. This sounds very reassuring to us in Estonia. Now, Daniela, would you like to pick up anything you have heard in the discussions?
I'd just like to underline a few points. So thank you all for participating, and in particular to our 2 speakers from Estonia, because your remarks, not only added very, very interesting perspectives from Estonia, but also additional substance and very concrete proposals. And I think that is what should keep us busy in the coming weeks and months, to add to the list of practical ideas that we have put down in the group, which is a way to, I guess, develop the conversation we have to have across the Atlantic. So thank you so much for that. In particular, your focus was of course on the digital cyber piece, but also on security, which of course are 2 key issues. Let me just briefly also share a comment on the CAI, as it's called, the investment agreement with China. I'm among those who also believes it came at the wrong moment in time. And the argument that has been made by the European negotiators is that this has been a year-long process, and this now came to a conclusion because the time was ripe for this. It was a political choice to do so at this point in time, on the European side as well. So we have to acknowledge that. So my conclusion from this is, it has been concluded, the Europeans think they got concessions from the Chinese side they didn't have before, and they might not have gotten afterwards. However, what this, I think, now needs is a very, very thorough and honest conversation as soon as the Biden administration has come into office on what the joint perspectives are on China and where to take it from here. We know that the ratification of this agreement will take a long time. It may not go through. And some questions remain open, in particular, the way the human rights question is going to be implemented and assessed over time. So while I think that it was not the right decision to push through the agreement now, I do think it is a call on even more transatlantic and a quicker transatlantic conversation now to be had on the issues that Tori in particular outlined. Other than that, I think the pressure on the Europeans is particularly high to be forward-leaning and come up with a convincing set of proposals beyond China and in all the areas that we touched upon, because we are facing a unique window of opportunity now after January 20th. Of course, the developments in the past week in Washington have made the assessment on the European side, I guess, even stronger, that the Biden administration will be mostly focused on domestic affairs. But as we highlighted in our report and also in the discussion today, the domestic situation, the resilience of democracy, the cohesion within society is the fundamental base of the way we think about our mutual relationship, but also about our role in the world. And so I think Europe has to reach out as quickly as possible, make concrete proposals that are of mutual benefit, and there are many, as we have outlined. And with that, the work begins on January 21st, I hope.
Thank you very much, Daniela. Now, Kate, would you like to come in with your final remarks?
Just very briefly, as it was said in the beginning, for Estonia, the smooth and not rusted transatlantic relations is crucial. I mean, it's literally from what our well-being depends on. And that's why I think that we are willing and ready to go as many extra miles as needed. And if there is anything practical we can do, we are definitely willing and ready to do so. I just really hope that the action plan that comes with the report, that we can start with the action plans right away, because I think this is what we need right now, and using the momentum is really what I hope that we all understand. So thank you again, everyone, and I think it's really great work. Thank you.
And Merle, back once again to the cyber field.
Thank you. Recognizing the time, I would just add that we live in exciting times, and picking up on the comment on David Sanger that we will shortly hear about announcements. I think it's unique about you working on the report and putting things in there that we all are now seeing being implemented, and it's great to be part of the discussion and debate on the transatlantic tech issues that continues. And I'd be humbled to be part of it with the DGAP, Belfer Center, and ICDS. Thanks.
Thank you, Merle. So now it is time to conclude. Let me thank once again, especially Nick and Daniela, for putting this wonderful project together. I'm sure we will all be missing the discussions now that the project is over, but of course now the real work has to begin with actually moving ahead with revitalizing the transatlantic relationship, and it is indeed extremely important to have these discussions with both sides of the Atlantic engaged and exchanging our views, and in spite of the differences of opinion that we have on some issues, to remind ourselves what is it that binds us together, why it is so important, especially looking at the global changes in the balance of power, the systemic rivalry between democracy and authoritarian countries, why it is so important to work hard for the transatlantic relationship to revive in future. Thank you, everyone, all the members of the strategy group. Thank you to the Estonian experts, and of course, thank you to the audience for being with us. Now it is time to close the event.